Today marks our 50th episode, and I'd like to say how grateful I am to have you all as my listeners. It's been a remarkable journey so far, and I know that the next 50 will be just as interesting. In the coming months, I'll continue to bring you stories of the bizarre and unexplained, and in return, I hope that you'll continue to listen and share your own experiences as well. So with that in mind, it's my pleasure to bring you several more accounts involving a variety of paranormal phenomena shared by our listeners.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision, I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast. I am your host, Nick Ryan. As always, before we start the show, I want to say thank you to our wonderful patrons, Robin, Cassandra, Julie, Courtney, Tiffany, Tom, Stephen, Mystica, and Carly. We appreciate your continued support and generosity. Our first story of the night comes from Gerard. Gerard calls their experience Forest Spirits. Gerard says, I've recently started listening to your podcast on Spotify, and it made me want to share my story. This happened to me and my friends way back in 2009. We went to our friend's province for summer vacation in Vegan. One day we decided to have fun on the nearby beach, which is also near a forest, where we drank, sang, ate, and played. It was almost midnight when we decided to call it a night, because we had to wake up early in the morning and get ready to go back to the city. When we returned to our friend's house, one of us suddenly felt ill. He thought he was just exhausted, and he'd be fine in the morning. But the next day, he started to have a fever, and started breathing heavily. We all became worried, and decided to bring him to the nearby hospital, and had him checked. The doctor said it was a normal fever, and gave us some medicine and told us to give him some rest and plenty of water. We followed the doctor's instructions, so we went to our friend's home. My sick friend was lying on the sofa resting, when my friend's grandfather came in to bring freshly harvested crops. He saw our sick friend and asked what had happened. We told him what happened, and after that, he went and looked at our sick friend. Then, he suddenly spoke to us with a sense of urgency. He said, "Your friend is not sick. He's not here. He's still on the beach. Go there and call for him before it's too late. You must call him back before midnight today, or he'll die." At first we were very skeptical, but I believe in that stuff, so I convinced my other friends to just follow. We went again to the beach. We shouted his name over and over again. We also went to the nearby forest and called his name. Some of us were shouting playfully because they didn't believe in paranormal stuff, and after about 3 hours of shouting and calling him, my friend's mother called and told us that our sick friend was now sitting up and feeling okay. We rushed back to see if it was true, and then we saw him sitting and drinking a lot of water. We asked him how he felt, and apparently he didn't remember anything after he went home. After that, we asked our friend's grandpa what had happened. He told us that our sick friend had had too much fun in the area and was lured by forest spirits near the beach. Some forest spirits have a tendency to abduct or lure people who seems to have too much fun in the area and want them to be part of the forest and have fun with them forever. It was an experience I wouldn't forget. Thank you for reading this if the story gets accepted. I have a lot more stories from sleep paralysis and other creepy stuff that has happened to me. Until then, thank you. Gerard. Our next story comes from Eric. Eric's experience is called Shadow People and Apparitions. Eric says, back in August of 2018, I started a second job at a church that I attend. It was a weekend gig, cleaning the school and the church. It started off pretty easy. I would come in early on Saturday morning in order to beat everyone there so I could clean without interference, and then come in Sunday afternoon. One Sunday afternoon, while cleaning the classrooms, I started hearing what sounded like a large crowd in the hallway. I looked out and saw no one. There were a couple of teachers getting stuff ready for the next day, but nothing that justified the noise. This went on and off for the rest of the shift. I got a little spooked, and I told my wife about it. She thought that perhaps I was spooking myself because I listened to too many paranormal podcasts. I took her advice and listened to something else. Over the next few weeks, this phenomenon continued. It didn't matter if it was 5 in the morning or 5 in the afternoon. This was not an old building. Nothing creepy about it. It was a fairly new and modern-looking church building. No cemetery or the like. One Saturday morning while cleaning the boys' bathroom, I was wiping down the 3 faucets, and when I got to the last one, suddenly the first faucet turned on. Needless to say, I never cleaned the boys' bathroom so fast. Later that shift, it was time to mop. I went in and filled the mop bucket. I grabbed the mop and was ready to go. Just as I was about to leave the room, the hose turned on. I was like, hell no. I spoke into the air and said, I ain't got time for this. Leave me alone. I crossed myself and finished the day. As time went on, I never had another water faucet incident, but the strange noises continued. As fate would have it, a couple months later, while cleaning the boys' bathroom, I got the feeling that I was being watched. It was Saturday morning around 6-ish. I turned around and saw a dark head peek around the corner. I jumped around, and then a dark gray figure with a staticky outline ran across the bathroom and disappeared into the far wall. It was about the size of a 7 to 9-year-old kid. I nearly pooped myself. I took a break, came back, and quickly finished cleaning. This wouldn't be the last shadow person I would see here. Sometime later, at least a couple of months later, I was ready to vacuum the hallway with a very large, oversized vacuum cleaner. I was ready to start when I looked at the end of the hall, and there was a very large figure. Much like the one before this one, it was dark gray with a staticky outline. I guess it was roughly about 6'5", and really fat. At this point, I wasn't scared. If anything, I was more angry. I proceeded to just do my work, with or without the specter there. Whatever it was disappeared. I never saw another shadow parishioner again. After that, it was always noises and the feeling of being constantly watched. From time to time, I would feel intense anger or malice following me. Toward the end of my time there, on a late Friday night, I came in to clean because of a wedding the following morning. I was finishing up with mopping the sanctuary. I looked up, and through the glass windows of the door, I saw a golden-like lady walk from the navvies toward the school hallway. I say a lady because she had long hair, feminine features, and a long flowing dress, much like a wedding dress. At first I thought it was a trick of the lighting from a car driving by from the Beltline, since it was around midnight. I followed her to a classroom. There was no way someone could open the doors because I had the keys. I went into the classroom and it was dark, and when I turned on the light, no one was there. Strange, but yet not for this church. After that, I started delivering pizza, not because of the paranormal, but better money for a second job. Our next story comes from Crystal. Crystal's story is entitled, My Dead Grandmother. Crystal says, Hi. I recently discovered your podcast, and I can't stop listening to it. Also, it's great that I found it, because I always wanted to share this experience. Keep up the great work. I'm telling you this personal paranormal encounter I had when I was little. My mom told me about it when I was a teen, and I have very blurry images of what happened. It was December here in Puerto Rico. My great-grandmother, who I had never met because she was really old and always in the hospital, told my parents hundreds of times that she wanted to meet me and see our house. She obviously couldn't, because of her condition, and my parents didn't want me in the hospital because as a child I got sick very easily. When I was little, I used to climb out of my crib and go walking around the house, to then go to my parents' room. My mom told me it was a little after midnight when I went to her room to tell her that there was a woman in our living room. She freaked out. So she woke up my dad, who stood up and went to see what it was. There was no one. My mom told me that she sat me down on her bed and told me to please describe what I saw. In her words, referring to my words, I said, "She was old. She was wearing white, long, old lady pajamas, and she was just standing by the Christmas tree. Her white hair was up in a little bun. She just looked at me and smiled. After that, she just left, but she didn't open the door. She went through it, as if she was air." My dad said his grandmother's name, and my mom didn't know how to react. She always bought white long pajamas and wore them all the time, even in the hospital. Also, since my dad was little, she always had her hair up in a bun. He called the hospital immediately. She had died a little after midnight. Even though it sounds scary, I feel that it's scary in a good way, because she finally came to meet me so she could rest in peace. Our next story comes from Dean. Dean calls their experience, "Creature to be Feared." Dean says, "I have been wanting to share more of my stories, but with some, it's hard to know where to begin. As some of the stories you've been reading are steered more toward unknown creatures, I will share this one. I have shared before about how I spent 2 years in Venezuela attending a private boarding school located on the edge of the Orinoco River when I was in high school. The dorms used to take trips on the river on weekends as a way to get the kids out and doing some physical activity. These trips often included strange and bizarre experiences, which now seem insane and often dangerous for them to have taken young children on while the children were under the school's care. These activities included things such as swimming in the muddy river that was also home to piranha, large anacondas, stingrays, and alligators. They also often took the boys in the dorm along on hunting trips with the local natives, and had been known to come back with pets, ocelots, anacondas, sloths, and other wild creatures. This may seem a bit extreme and absurd, but you have to understand that the school was concerned with bigger dangers to the students, such as Colombian guerrillas kidnapping white foreigners, such as existed in our dorms, excessive political unrest, including rioting, gas shortages, and severe corruption. They did not worry as much about the physical dangers of a rainforest jungle. All that to say that a dorm trip up the river to an area near the natives' favorite hunting grounds was not something out of the ordinary. As our guide, we had an ancient elder from the local village. He guided us far up the winding river. It took us a full day, sunrise to sunset, to slowly move up a creek only 3 feet wide, just wide enough to squeeze our longboat, chiseled out of a large tree. Despite the jungle that seemed to encroach on the banks of the creek, it was deceivingly deep. As such, we could most often use our motor to push us through, except for the sections where the width of the creek was so narrow that we all had to get out in order to lighten the load, so our boat could be pushed through the sections of the creek as narrow as 1.5 feet. After sleeping in hammocks in the jungle under some makeshift grass roofs, we awoke the second day to go exploring. We hiked even further up the narrow creek's edge, with our guide promising us cold fresh water springs at the top of the mountain. By noon, we had stumbled upon a place where the level creek met the curving rocky waterfalls with a large pool of water at the base. Half our group continued on to find the source of the springs at the top of the waterfalls, and the rest of us, with our guide, promised to wait for them at the base. Some of the teen boys became impatient and decided to try out their spear hunting skills in the large muddy pool of water. Upon wading into the water, our elderly guide came running up, yelling and waving his arms. "Get out! Get out! Bob lives in there." He didn't actually call it Bob, but used a native name of which I cannot pronounce, so I will refer to it as Bob. We were all very confused, as we had never heard of this Bob. At the same time, we were baffled by this elderly native, who was seemingly afraid of not a single dangerous animal that lived in the jungle, and in his younger years was known to be a great warrior in their wars between tribes, but was now utterly terrified by this Bob. He was so scared he wouldn't even touch the edge of the pond in order to pull the young men out. He stood at the edge pleading and crying for them to save themselves and get out. In the end, Foolish teen boys are not easily dissuaded from doing anything that is deemed dangerous or foolhardy. They were determined to go in, and so, for a half an hour, they hunted, and the elderly native kept his watch over them, a spear in one hand and a machete in the other, shaking with fear, not daring to touch even a toe into the water. After the boys gave up their fruitless pursuit of hunting, I asked the elder to tell me about Bob. He told me of a creature he had seen with his own eyes in his younger days, who lived in the jungle nearby and hunted the fish in that pond. No native dared to enter his sacred water, as the last two who did had died horrible deaths, being eaten alive by Bob. He paced out Bob's length, and it was about 6 to 8 yards long. He described it as being like an alligator with leathery skin, but standing taller than a man, and having sharp teeth. He told us that Bob was the reason they no longer hunted on this side of the hunting grounds, and why they never entered the pool, as when Bob was in it, he could not be seen beneath its murky water until it was too late. So was it an overgrown alligator? I doubt it, as this is the same native who would show the boys how to hunt and wrestle full-grown alligators with nothing more than a belt knife. I've always wondered what is living in that jungle that makes natives so afraid. My theory, I think it's the same creature I have heard of living on the top of a mesa in southern Venezuela. There is a Venezuelan documentary I saw, and would love to get my hands on if anyone knows where I can find a copy, of the scientists who went up to study the jungle at the top that is separated by cliffs from humans. They too met a creature who lived in the pools and hunted fish. They described it to be similar to a brontosaurus, but smaller. Dean. Our next story of the night comes from Nadiri. Nadiri's story is called Sweet, Then Evil. Nadiri says, on December 7th, 1999, my Grandpa Jim passed away. We still don't know the reason behind the death, except for the unknown fluid found in his lungs. Anyways, the following week, on December 14th, 1999, I was born. I, of course, don't remember this, but instead of my first words being Mama or Dada, my first word was Papa. That wouldn't be that unusual, except for the fact that Grandpa Jim never wanted to be called Grandpa. He wanted to be called Papa, and it took me another month or so to say Mama or Dada after that. I've always had dreams about a young man rescuing me from monsters, or scary people, or any bad, well, anything. The man has deep brown eyes and the sweetest smile I've ever seen. It made me feel all warm and fuzzy. One reoccurring dream I've had, for the first 10 years of my life, was where I was nearly drowning, but at the last second, I feel an arm around me, pulling me up to the surface. I never get to see the face of my savior, but I know it's Papa Jim. I didn't know the man in my dreams was him until around 2 weeks ago, when I was going through some of my parents' really old photo albums, and I saw a photo of Papa Jim getting married to Grandma Kathy, and I knew that was the same man from my dreams. I'm not going to lie, it scared me. A lot. For the past 2 weeks, I've been dreaming about him even more, but each dream I have, he changes a little. The reason I'm finally writing about this is that the sweet Papa that I used to know and love has left, and what's replaced him is something just not quite right. He still has his deep brown eyes, but it seems that there is some sense of evil behind them, and his sweet smile that used to make me feel at ease and safe now makes my heart fall to the pit of my stomach, and I get a feeling of doom when I see it. He used to be the one to rescue me, but now he's the one that chases me. It's not only in dreams that I feel him now. I don't know if it's my imagination playing with me, but when I'm in my living room alone, I feel like he's staring at me. I used to feel this after waking up from one of the sweet dreams about him, but then it was almost comforting. Now it's like he's watching, waiting, planning to do, well, I don't know what, but I'm scared that he's going to hurt me. I think he never wanted me to know that it was him, and now that I do, he's angry. I honestly don't understand and need help figuring out what to do. My parents and I don't believe in witches or ghosts. Well, I didn't used to. Now my perspective has changed, and I know that whatever he is, he's going to be mad that I'm sharing his story, but I need help figuring out what to do. I'm no longer okay with him being here. Our next story of the night comes from Gillian. Gillian calls their story, The Spooning Ghost. Gillian says, "Hi there. I stumbled across your podcast for the first time tonight and listened to the Lake Michigan Triangle episode. Loved it. I grew up in Wisconsin, 2 blocks from the lake, and spent every summer sailing on it or swimming, though thankfully not in the Triangle. I live in Chicago now, and while I never heard of any of the stories you shared in the episode before, it doesn't surprise me a bit. My parents would always warn us that it had brought down big ships, and to never underestimate its power. My only experience with the paranormal happened when I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the late 90s. Cambridge is full of old, spooky-looking places, but the apartment complex I lived in at the time was sort of 60s or 70s modern, and otherwise unremarkable. One afternoon, not long after moving in, I was in my bedroom folding laundry when I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I even closed my blinds, but the feeling stuck with me a little. I went to put some clothes in my closet, and when my back was to the bed, I heard it creak, like someone was laying on it. My head whipped around at the sound, but there was no one there. I was a little startled, but I figured I just imagined it. A few weeks later, my roommate's friend Chad was spending the night on our living room couch. It was a running joke that Chad and I were going to hook up, and whenever he'd stay the night, and we'd all be turning in, he'd say, "I'll be in a minute, honey." So on this particular night, I just laid down and turned over on my side, with my back to the bedroom door. Suddenly I felt someone lying behind me, and the pressure of 5 fingers gently pulling me toward them, like someone trying to spoon to me. Thinking it was Chad, I waved my hand back to slap what I thought would be his side, and my hand hit nothing but air. I shot out of bed so fast, it felt like I went from laying under the covers to standing facing the bed in one fluid move. No sign of Chad, and my bedroom door was still closed. I screamed and ran out to the living room. Even though I knew Chad realistically couldn't have made it out of my room so fast, I still asked him if he'd been in there. He had not. I told him what happened and asked if I could sleep in the living room with him. At first he thought I was joking and was like, "This is your ploy to get in bed with me, isn't it?" But then could see that I was legit freaked out. I was nervous to go back in the bedroom the next day and didn't even feel comfortable being alone in the apartment for a few days, but I eventually got over it and nothing else ever happened. Still, the memory of it is so vivid even 20 years later. How do you mistake the feeling of a hand on your belly and being pulled close to someone? It's not like I was drifting off to sleep either. I had just turned over and was fully awake. Strangely, I had the feeling that I had startled whatever or whomever it was, as much as I'd startled myself. Anyway, thanks for reading about my small brush with the paranormal, and I can't wait to listen to more episodes of your awesome podcast. Take care and stay safe. Gillian. Our last story of the night comes from Adrian. Adrian calls their story, Ghost, Premonition, or Doppelganger. Adrian says, "Hi Nick, I hope this story finds you well. The experience I want to share with you I have only told a handful of people, and I haven't mentioned it for probably 2 decades. During high school in Ada, Michigan, is when I first started having notable paranormal experiences. I'm likely to share others with you in the future, but for today, just this one. It is the first one that I firmly and vividly remember. One night, I suddenly woke up to find myself immobile, but I didn't panic. I looked slightly to my left across the room to see a very tall man, almost as tall as the ceiling, standing by my shelves, holding one of my stuffed animals, a popple, if you remember those, cranking its tail around like a music box. I don't recall hearing any music, though. He looked up and saw me looking at him, and he told me in a friendly voice, "Don't worry, just go back to sleep." And I did, with no problem. Later, I awoke again to find him sitting right next to my bedside, leaning in, watching me sleep. He saw that I was startled and smiled a little bit and said once again, "It's all right, just go back to sleep." Again, I had no problem falling back to sleep. I could see him clearly, and I never forgot what he looked like. I was never visited by him again, strangely. But where it gets interesting is some years later, when I was going through orientation at the art school I was going to attend. I met a man who was the spitting image of this ghost that I had seen in my room years before. Once I saw this man, I was shocked silent. He was built the same way as the ghost. Very tall, shaggy hair, round face. Peaceful demeanor. I kept it to myself how startled I was to see this living person looking all too much like this spirit. That very same day, later in the orientation tour, he and I introduced ourselves formally, and we have been friends ever since. But I often wonder how it's possible that this spirit can look like this man, or vice versa. So strange, but I look back on it fondly, and it now reminds me of when I met my friend. I want to thank you for your podcasts. I enjoy listening to them very much, and I share them with others who I think would also listen in. Adrian. As we end today's episode, I'd like to say again how much I appreciate all of you listening over the past 50 episodes. Until next time, I hope that you all have a safe and healthy week, and I'd like to say a big thank you to Gerard, Eric, Crystal, Dean, Nadiri, Gillian, and Adrian for writing in and sharing their experiences with all of us. If you believe that you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, you can contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com. You may also visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember that no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. All of our contact information, as well as the sources that were referenced for today's episode, can be found in the show notes. You can also get involved with the podcast by joining our forum and by following us on social media. If you're wondering how you can support the podcast, you're doing it right now just by listening, and we appreciate it. You can also help by subscribing to the podcast and by sharing it with all of your friends. If you're looking for additional ways to show your support, you can visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries and become a patron. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every week and are available on all of your favorite podcast apps, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you so much for listening, and please remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.